So actually, this is a really great opportunity for me, partly because I used to do a lot of teaching in the 4E program and in the MSW program more generally, and haven't taught in the program for a couple of years. So it's nice to get a chance to talk about some of our work and hopefully hear from you guys a bit and keep on top of what the program's doing. So I should say up front, so I really want this, so I have slides and I could talk for the next hour and a half, but I'd really much rather this be a conversation. I really want you to interrupt me, to challenge me, to disagree with me, to talk to each other, to say, we can change directions, etc. The other thing I thought I'd start with is just sort of putting in a plug for Wisconsin, sort of how great the policy landscape is and how great I think our history of the university, the School of Social Work, the Institute for Research on Poverty, collaborating with the state, and doing some really cool, important policy relevant work here. So one of the things that really impressed me when I came here, and this is almost unheard of in other places. So when I came for my interview 10 years ago at the School of Social Work, some of my interview appointments were with people. It wasn't called Department of Children and Families then, but were with people at Department of Children and Families. And it was really important to know, what did they think of the kinds of work I was doing? And would there be places for me to collaborate with them? And I think there's this really great relationship that is, a rare or somewhat rare example of research really informing policy and practice. And if you look sort of historically, Wisconsin's been at the cutting edge of doing policy experiments and doing practice experiments for at least, the last 50 years or so. So we did, big child support experiments. I'll tell you a little bit about one of them today as it relates to child welfare. During welfare reform, we did, whether you agree with policies or not, we try new things, right? Right now, I'll tell you a little bit at the end of the talk today about a pilot project we're doing in Milwaukee that was really spearheaded by the Children's Trust Fund here, but it's in collaboration with Department of Children and Families and the School of Social Work and IRP. So there's these really great opportunities to experiment with new ideas and new policies and practices. And I've really found it, so I've been here since 2004. And so two different administrations, a Democratic and a Republican administration, I found that to be very true across both. And I think it's I think it's something that's sort of ingrained in Wisconsin. And I think that, that makes it really exciting to be here. So today what I'm going to talk about is generally talk about understanding the links between child maltreatment and poverty or limited economic resources. And I want to say at the outfront, so a large part of this work is based on collaborations with Christy Slack, who's also on our faculty, and that, many of you will have either interacted with her or had her as a professor, or will in the future. And lots of this is, with other colleagues either on campus or around the country, including many of our doctoral students. So Bomi Kim is here, and she's worked on some of these projects too. And so largely what I'm going to do is to give you a little overview. So we'll talk quickly about some national estimates and trends in child maltreatment. I'll assume that many of you know this already. And then we'll sort of talk about what do we know about this relationship between poverty and child maltreatment, and then what we don't know. And then so the I guess fourth major thing I'll talk about is, largely we know a lot about correlations between poverty and child maltreatment, and we know a lot about the characteristics of the families involved in the CPS system. But we know much less about whether these relationships are causal. So essentially, is low income or poverty status a causal factor in child maltreatment? And I'll talk a little bit about what I mean by causality when we get to that point. And then the last thing I'm going to do is tell you about this Project GAIN, which is stands for Gaining Access to Income Now. And it's a randomized pilot project that we've been doing in Milwaukee for going on 4 years now. And I'll talk about, sort of what the project does and, where we are with the evaluation. And it's largely focused on, can we prevent child maltreatment by providing economic resource supports alone? And no other supports through at least this project. And part of what I'm going to do is sort of take you on a tour through, I'll give you some overview of national work, and then I'll really kind of take you on a tour of work that Christy and I have done collectively and separately in the last 10 or 15 years, sort of looking at these issues. So I'll sort of walk you through the progression of our studies in this direction. Okay. So if we look over time, so over the last, roughly 20 years, at trends in child maltreatment, so for the most part, child maltreatment's been declining. So these are victimization rates from official CPS reports. And so I wanted to point out a couple things. So first, physical abuse and sexual abuse rates are much, much lower than neglect, which I assume most of you know. So just to get them on the same chart, we've doubled physical abuse and tripled sexual abuse. So these are much lower rates. I'm just trying to get them on a scale that we can all look at. But essentially what we see is about 7 kids, per 1,000 are going to be victims of child neglect. Neglect hasn't declined as much over time, but still over this 1990 to 2012 period, it's declined by about 14%. If we look at physical and sexual abuse, so they're much lower to begin with, and they've declined really steeply, right? So by 54% for physical abuse and by 62% for sexual abuse. So one thing to keep in mind is that these are official report rates, right? So this isn't, or official victimization rates, so this doesn't necessarily fully reflect underlying rates, but the trend has been away from victimization, and we'll talk about some reasons why that might be. The other thing that I think is really interesting to think about is generally over time, you see when the economy gets bad, child maltreatment and particularly neglect rates increase. And when the economy gets better, they decrease. And you can see some of that, in these early 2001, 2002 recessions, neglect goes up and you see flattening out here. But what's really interesting is in this last recession, at least official victimization rates didn't increase at all. So they mostly stayed flat. And arguably, this sort of trend away from maltreatment or toward lower rates continued. And so we'll talk a little bit about why that might be. And so, but one thing to also think about is counterfactuals are really important. So stayed flat, but compared to what? So one thing is, well, maybe if there wasn't a recession, it would have continued decreasing, and it didn't decrease, right? It flattened out. And we'll talk about sort of different implications for what that might be. It also might be that this is not about, so this doesn't reflect the underlying rates very well. So maybe during the recession, for a variety of reasons, actual maltreatment stopped declining or went up, but it wasn't picked up by surveillance or it wasn't picked up by CPS. And this could reflect lots of factors, including, funding for mandatory reporters. So are there less mandatory reporters seeing families? Are they spending less time with them? Could reflect resources of CPS, could reflect a lot of factors, and we'll talk a little bit about that. So our two big sort of sources of data for national child maltreatment rates are the NCANS data, so the National Child Abuse and Neglect Reporting System. And those data are reported by all states on an annual basis to the federal government. And so if we look at in 2012, right, about 43 children per 1,000, so about a little over 4%, were investigated or assessed by CPS, right? A higher number, almost 5%, were reported. And if we look at the victimization rate, it's just under 1% of all children. And so you think about, well, is 1% a big number or a small number? I would argue it's a pretty big number for 1 out of 100 kids to be substantiated for child maltreatment. And so then there's this, this other concern that is CPS involvement just the tip of the iceberg? And are there a lot more kids who are at risk of maltreatment or maltreated that don't show up? And so roughly every 10 years or so, we do these national incident studies. And these national incident studies get what they call community sentinels, community leaders, and often mandatory reporters to make estimates of child maltreatment in their communities, right? And regardless of whether it was reported or not. And they do it on two different standards, one called endangerment and one called harm. And the point I want to make here is just if you think about the harm standard, you're almost at double the substantiation standard, right? So you're at 1.7 kids per thousand as opposed to 0.9. If you think about the endangerment standard, you're at 40 kids per thousand, and it's actually, relatively similar. We don't necessarily know if those are the same kids, and I think there's some evidence that there's both under and over-reporting in CPS, right? So we miss some kids that need intervention, and we certainly also take in kids that might not need intervention. Okay, so that is a little bit of backdrop. Let's sort of move to thinking about what do we know and what do we not know about the relationship between poverty and child maltreatment. Okay, so what do we know? So some of this should be familiar to many of you. So in most measures of maltreatment, whether it's system involvement, whether it's at the individual level, whether it's at the community level, whether it's at the state level, we find correlations between income or access to resources and Child Protective Services involvement and out-of-home placement and all kinds of measures of maltreatment. So this is true across the developed countries. So a relatively recent review of Child Protective Services systems across the developed countries concluded that the strongest and most common predictor of Child Protective Services involvement across all of those countries was low income status. So that's even true in countries that, like the Scandinavian countries and the Western European countries that transfer a lot more income, that do a lot more income support. If we look at, if we look at family income, we're going to see much more involvement with CPS, much more placement out of home. If we look at these national incidence surveys, we see a really strong correlation between income and both harm and endangerment. It tends to be strongest for neglect. If we look at child maltreatment report rates by community, so what we tend to see is the poorest communities have the highest report rates. We also see that as unemployment increases in a community, so does, or poverty increases in a community, so does CPS involvement, right? Receipt of public assistance has historically been predictive of CPS involvement, and there's sort of two takes on that. So one piece is it's just a marker of being low income or poor, and it's correlated in the same way that any other measure of low income is. Another take, which I think is less true now than it used to be, is that folks who receive public assistance are more exposed to mandatory reporters, and there's greater surveillance. More and more in a lot of our particularly income transfer systems, you don't necessarily see that many mandatory reporters anymore. You essentially, you're not really getting as much assessment, so I think that's less the case now. If we look at state by year level analyses, so there are a bunch of papers around welfare reform in the early 2000s that looked at, between the late 80s and the 2000s, looking at state level factors and how they tracked with Child Protective Services involvement. And what they essentially found was, in the states and years, as poverty increased, Child Protective Services involvement went up. As the proportion of single-parent families increased, the same thing happened. As employment decreased, the same thing happened. As generosity of welfare benefits or cash transfer benefits decreased, we saw increases in CPS involvement and things like that. So both evidence that at the macro level, economic policies and economic trends are going to affect CPS. The evidence on employment is somewhat more mixed, and it depends. So you get different trends if you look at macro level or individual level measures. You also get different trends if you look at different portions of the population. So whether you're talking about employment in the context of also receiving welfare benefits or not, whether you're talking about employment at certain wage levels or not, and I'll talk a little bit about that. But I think the verdict on employment is less clear. And then the last thing I want to say, and I'll talk about some of this the evidence in a minute. So despite that there's an overall trend toward either flat or decreasing Child Protective Services involvement rates, during the Great Recession, there's also been a lot of variation across states, right? In both economic trends and in, and I'll show you some of this, and in CPS rates. And so despite this generally declining or flat time trend, there's some evidence that states that were hit hardest by the recession may be seeing some increases in child maltreatment and on some measures, ways that may not be getting picked up by the CPS system as much. Okay. So the next thing I'm going to do is sort of talk through 4 sets of studies that Christy and I independently or together have done that sort of address these connections. So the first thing we're going to look at is among disadvantaged families. So among families who are already low income, what predicts whether they get involved with CPS or not? The second thing that I think is really important is to think about, parenting knowledge and behaviors. So parenting skills, ability, and socioeconomic status or income are often correlated, right? And I argue a lot when I talk to different groups that the same skills that you need to be productive in your work life or to be successful in employment are basically the same skills you need to be productive and successful as a parent, right? So a lot of what you need is impulse control, right? A lot of what you need is somewhat, patience, is regulating your responses. And we kind of think of parenting and employment skills as being quite different. But even if you look at home visiting programs that are generally geared around parenting, right? Some of their biggest effects are around economic situations of the moms, right? Around continuing education, ability to hold a job, decisions about having later children, things like that, right? So I would argue that some of these skills are important. And if we want to try to get at what's the role of income, we need to separate that from what's the role of parenting, because they're very correlated. A third piece we looked at was, so what happens when families get sanctioned by welfare? So when you're receiving a benefit and that benefit gets cut, right? So what happens as far as CPS involvement? And then the last thing we looked at was sort of how do socioeconomic factors and public policies affect children's living arrangements. So why don't I stop for a minute and see if there are questions about things I've talked about so far? Okay, so child maltreatment or CPS involvement among disadvantaged families. So one thing I do want to say too is, so in different studies, I'm going to use different measures to talk about child maltreatment. And sometimes I'm going to talk about CPS involvement. Sometimes I'm going to talk about behaviors that may actually capture maltreatment. Sometimes I'm going to talk about behaviors that are a clear risk, but are not actual maltreatment. So we can think about very frequent spanking is associated, is correlated with maltreatment. It's a risk factor, but for the most part, if you're not leaving a mark, if you're not causing injury, it's not necessarily maltreatment. And I think it's somewhat unfortunate that we have to sort of bounce between measures that don't necessarily reflect the same thing. But there's a big limitation in the literature is if you're going to go out and talk to families and interview families and observe families, and you observe actual maltreatment, you have to report it, right? So essentially and IRBs generally won't let you ask questions, institutional review boards that protect human subjects won't let you ask questions often that will explicitly elicit maltreatment, right? So there's a well-known measure called the conflict tactics scales. And it's been used in anonymous phone surveys and anonymous mail surveys to get at maltreatment. And so they have sort of a mild violence, a sort of physical aggression, medium violence, and a severe violence. And so if you ask people anonymously, you can ask, well, did you burn or scald your child? Did you do these sort of clear maltreatment things? If you're going to follow people and you know who they are and you're going to follow them longitudinally, you just can't ask that, right? So it's too sensitive for an IRB to let you do that, and it's putting people at risk of a bunch of other things. So essentially, what we've done in many of these studies is had to take minor violence and sort of use that as a risk factor for maltreatment, or come up with some combinations of factors. The other thing I want to say about CPS involvement, right? So, roughly, a third of kids or so who get reported to CPS, and about a little less than half that are investigated, are going to be found to be victims of child maltreatment nationally. I would still argue that just having a screened in, an investigated, or an assessed CPS interaction is a pretty good sign that a family's at risk. So they may not have crossed a bar into maltreatment, right? But there's most likely some struggles going on in that family, that whether or not they're maltreatment or not, there's some functional problems likely. We also know that the families that get investigated and there's no maltreatment finding get re-reported and re-investigated at pretty high rates, right? So I would argue that in and of itself, maybe not just a report, but an investigated or assessed report is certainly a risk factor. Okay. So one of the things that we looked at in a study of women in the late 90s who were in Illinois, who were receiving welfare around the time of welfare reform, around the shift from AFDC to TANF, was looking at, as women were trying to be moved into employment and off of welfare, how do different packages of employment and welfare correlate with CPS involvement. So this is mostly just looking at investigative reports. And essentially the idea was that women can completely go off welfare and just work, right? Women can combine work and welfare. Women could just stay on welfare. And essentially, the main takeaway was that welfare receipt in the absence of employment was associated with greater CPS involvement, but combining employment with welfare was associated with reduction in CPS employment, okay? So part of this probably reflects two things. So one is what I'd call social selection, right? So in many ways, income and your ability to care for your children and employment are going to be driven by a set of characteristics that you may or may not observe, right, that are probably driving both. So, one of them I just talked about was impulse control. So people who can control their impulses better are more likely to have a stable job or move into employment, are more likely to have higher wages, and all of those things. So I'm not going to argue that that's necessarily a causal story. The other thing is, in most cases, the women that were combining employment and income, are probably, have a greater earnings capacity, and even if we're controlling for income at the time, are probably on a higher level of wage trajectory over time. So essentially, I'm not going to make a causal argument, but I will, but it does seem to be that these things are correlated. Yeah.
So you haven't mentioned stress of being in 100% of the time.
Yeah.
Yet,
I am, and I will, and so I think that, so I'll talk in a little while about the mechanisms that I think link these things. And so there's actually two, so I'll say a minute about sort of during welfare reform, there was two ways of thinking about this, right? So one is that you're with your kids all the time, and it's stressful to take care of kids. Anybody who has kids knows that. Particularly if you have a lot of economic stress and don't have a lot of money. Possibly if you're getting even more stressed to move into work or to have a bunch of requirements around welfare reform. So you may see a bunch of stress that way that may result in increased child maltreatment. The flip is you may also see, as women move from welfare into work and don't necessarily get a care grant and don't necessarily have high quality childcare, you may see more lack of supervision, things like that. You may see more kids left with inappropriate caregivers. So it really could go either way, right? And we'll talk a little bit about that when we get into the theory stuff. Okay. Are there other questions? So the second thing I want to say is, so then we took a totally different sample. So just a sample of families that had a low birth weight birth in the late 80s, early 90s. And these families were followed for a long time, for 15 years or so. So it was part of the Infant Health and Development Program. And as part of this program, they really collected very in-depth data on child development, on parenting behaviors, on income, on family structure, and all these things. So we wanted to look at, this is a really good chance to kind of compare the impacts of socioeconomic status on income and work and those kinds of things to parenting behaviors. And so the parenting behaviors consisted of both questionnaires about parenting. So asking parents, do you do this activity? How often do you read to your kid? How many books do you have? Do you spank them? How often? But also a bunch of interviewer observations of moms with their kids, largely moms. And they were coding up like how warm was the mom, how receptive, those kinds of things. And then we had a bunch of interview scales around your knowledge of child development and child behavior. So so when a baby won't stop crying, what do you attribute that to? And do you think the child has control over that? What kinds of things, so your knowledge of what's a developmentally appropriate behavior around kids. And so what we found, and then we had some outcomes about suspected and confirmed maltreatment. And so what we essentially found was that both SES and parenting, as you'd expect, predicted maltreatment. They were both relatively stronger predictors of neglect than abuse. But what was really interesting to us is if you look at this relationship between income and child maltreatment, right? And you say, well, we're going to ignore parenting and we're going to see how strong that relationship is. And then we're going to say how much of that relationship is controlled for is accounted for by parenting, right? So in other words, often lower income families are less educated, they have less knowledge of child development, et cetera. And so when we do that, we find very little of that income piece is explained by parenting. And so what that sort of says is both are important, but they seem to have generally separate and independent effects on CPS involvement. So it's not necessarily the case that all of the income effect is attributable to different parenting abilities or different parenting styles or knowledge. Okay. So then we looked further and we wanted to look at, okay, so if we think about a lot of these types of factors, so what's the role of public policy? So public policy for low-income families, right, has a big impact on your income. Right? And it's partly you can get cash transfers in a pre-TANF era. You got to check from AFDC if you qualified and if you enrolled. You can think about food stamps as being a near cash transfer, right, that supports families. We can think about earned income tax credits, right? So there's lots of ways that public policy affects your income. And so one of the things I wanted to look at over time was how do, as benefits change, benefit levels change over time, as families change, as people divorce, remarry, repartner, move in with people, how does this affect the changes in their probability that their kids don't live with them anymore? And so when I say kids don't live with them, I mean the kid neither lives with their biological mom nor biological dad. And these are kids that started out that weren't put up for adoption or anything as infants. And I looked at whether they go into a placement in the child welfare system, and whether they go into a voluntary placement with a relative or something like that. And essentially what we see is as families lose income, so if you have a big income drop, your children are more likely to go into both of those types of placements and stop living with either parent. As families break up, so as essentially moms become single moms, kids are more likely to go into these placements. As moms have new partners who move in, right, as kids are more likely to start living out of home and not to go live with their dad, to go live with somebody else. And so this gives us a little bit more evidence that we might be moving toward causal relationships, because we're looking at the same families where things change. Instead of saying, well, there are different families that are likely to be married or not married. There are different families that are likely to be in high or low wage jobs. We're looking at families that move in and out of these positions. And then we also looked about the same thing about welfare benefit levels. So if we look at the same families in the same states over time, as well food stamps and FTC or TANF, depending on the year, benefit levels changed, we essentially saw some evidence that, if you're a family and you're receiving welfare and the benefit gets cut, not because of your behaviors, not a sanction, right, at the state level or decreases over time, your probability that your kids will stop living with you increased, right? So some evidence that these policies' effects on income may matter. Okay. So then we thought about, what is the role. So we were doing, some of this work around in the early 2000s when welfare reform was being heavily studied. And so, if we say, so essentially you can get a sanctions for a lot of reasons if you're getting welfare benefit. Many of them have to do with non-compliance around things, not complying with work or non-complying with different rules. There's probably some, so workers have some degree of discretion, so there's probably somewhat of a random effect. But there's clearly, it's also related to families' behaviors and attributes. So what we did was we'd say, let's look at families that get sanctioned by welfare, that get a cut in their grant, in their check. And let's try to control for the reasons that they got that cut, right? So because you didn't work, because you didn't do all these things. But let's see how that cut plays out in terms of their Child Protective Services reports and substantiations. And so the first thing we found was, in general, if you get a sanction, you get a cut to your grant, you're more likely to get reported to CPS and investigated by CPS. So the reason we think that this is probably, or partly at least, an income effect is that if you got a grant reduction that wasn't necessarily a sanction, right, could have been for another reason, family size change, things like that, you are also more likely to have a CPS report unless that reduction was made up for by other income. So if you had that reduction but you were able to work more or you were able to get more income, then that wasn't necessarily the case. These sanctions were much more closely associated with neglect than physical abuse, which plays into at least a story about being able to provide materially for a kid, less so into a stress story, perhaps, if you think about stress being more closely tied to physical abuse. Interestingly, these sanctions were related to increased investigations, but not necessarily substantiations, right? So what it meant is you're more likely to get reported, but not necessarily was there more likely to be a finding of victimization. And so this might partly reflect that, the child welfare system, you're not supposed to intervene for reasons of poverty alone in terms of substantiations, in terms of child removals and things like that. It may also mean that people are more likely to report you because you're struggling financially or because of worries about the conditions you're living in at ways that actually don't rise to the level of maltreatment. Okay. And so then the last thing I want to say is, so I've done a bunch of work on what I term substandard parenting. And so this is trying to get at actual parenting behaviors. So, and you can feel free to hate the term. Lots of people do. I started with calling it child maltreatment risk. People didn't like that either. And I think substandard parenting is a pretty good term, and I'll explain why. So what I wanted to say was, even if a family may not have fallen below a threshold that constitutes actual child abuse and neglect, we can think about parenting as occurring on a continuum. Okay? So you can think about it simply of, if you want to think about spanking, you spank your child from no times ever to 5 times a day, right? And there's an average and there's a distribution. If you think about how many times you hug your child, how many times you kiss your child, you read to your child, you can think about that over a whole host of measures. And so my basic thinking was 2 things. So one, kids that are at the very bottom of that distribution, if you think about the bottom being the poor parenting side, are most likely to be at high risk of maltreatment anyway, even if those behaviors aren't measuring maltreatment. And secondly, I would argue we should worry about those kids because it's likely to be associated with poor developmental outcomes whether or not it passes a bar for legal maltreatment. So what I essentially did was say, let's take a bunch of measures of parenting: warmth, hostility, spanking, medical care, a bunch of things like that, cognitive stimulation, and let's identify kids that are in the bottom 10th percentile. So those kids who 90% of other kids get more investment or higher quality parenting on that measure, right? So this is a pretty low bar. 90 kids out of 100 are going to get better parenting or higher quality parenting in that area. And so we, did I change? Somehow, okay. And so what I wanted to look at was, let's take a bunch of these same measures. Let's take a bunch of socioeconomic status, income, family structure, and let's see how they're associated with these measures of substandard parenting. And I can do it in individual domains, so let's look at just cognitive stimulation, just warmth. Or I can say, how many of these measures are you in the low part of, or are you in the low portion on any, lots of ways you can look at it. For the most part, right, what you essentially see is, lower income, unstable family structure, changes in maternal employment, things like that. Even controlling for lots of things and looking at changes over time are associated with substandard parenting in the same ways that we found for CPS involvement. So it's not necessarily the same kids, right? But we're seeing the same. So as your income drops, you're more likely to move down into that low level of parenting. As you lose a job, right? As you break up or repartner, those kinds of things. The other thing that's worth saying that I think makes a lot of sense is that you can predict much better whether a family is likely to fall into having any of those or falling below having 2 of those than particular types of maltreatment or of substandard parenting. And I think that makes sense for one reason. Parents have different skills, parents have different preferences. And so as income gets tight for one family, they're gonna say, oh, I'm gonna keep investing in my housing, but maybe food will get lower. Or I'm gonna, sacrifice on some child care, but keep feeding the kid, right? And so it makes sense to me that families choose or fall into different areas, even at the same income. But if you look at on the whole, they're likely to fall below that threshold in some area. And that makes a lot of sense to me. I find very similar effects of benefit levels and unemployment, right? So as unemployment increases, even in your community level, you're more likely to fall under that threshold. As welfare benefits are higher, you're likely to stay above that thresholds. And so one of the things that I would argue that this implies is that when we see these relationships between income and benefit levels and family structure and all this, with CPS involvement and out-of-home care, it probably doesn't just reflect monitoring or bias in the system. It probably does reflect some underlying changes in family functioning that go along with these things. I also have a recent paper that looks at, do these things, so these substandard parenting measures, predict child development, child behavior problems over time, child academic achievement over time, and things like that, in the same way as CPS involvement, right? So, and it turns out it's amazing how similar they are. So in other words, falling below, if you're in the bottom 10th percentile of parenting or you're involved with CPS, the correlation with more behavior problems later, with lower cognitive skills, is very, very similar. Right? Okay. Okay. Yep.
Did you take into account AODA as any of those substandard? Was that in there?
So I did not use that as the outcome. In some models, I control for that as a yeah.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. So there are some things that I kind of struggle with, because you could think of AODA, or you could even think of depression as both a predictor of parenting and a measure of parenting, right? Like if you're severely depressed, that's going to sort of play out in your parenting. I tended to not use it as a measure of parenting, but sometimes to control for it, right? So, there are other questions? So, some implications for thinking about this poverty and CPS involvement. So one question is, right, and you probably don't like the way it's framed, but are poor parents worse parents? And so, I don't know, right? They're more likely to fall below that threshold. They're more likely to get involved with CPS, right? So are they parenting at the same quality or not? And so we may not want to talk about it that way, right? But there is, some real concerns, and so I haven't said anything about the reasons yet, and we will talk about the reasons. But there are a lot of reasons to think that even taking the same person and putting them in a poor environment, or making them poor, which you can't actually do, versus giving them a decent amount of income and resources, that their parenting behaviors are going to change, right? And so and part of that, I think, has to do with choice sets, right? So I'm a professor at the University of Wisconsin. I have a good paying job. Not only, is it a good salary, in a relative sense, but, but it's also a stable salary. I know what I'm getting every month, and it's the same unless I get fired every month, right? Now, I have a lot of choices. I get to choose where I live. I get to choose where I send my kids to school. I have lots of choices for babysitters. I have lots of choices in many ways. If my kids are having struggles, I have lots of choices for doctors, for therapy, for all kinds of things. And most of my choices I have a pretty good choice set. So if I have, 20 choices for childcare, probably 15 or 18 of them are pretty good, and 2, 3, 5 might not be very good. So if you take me, same person, and put me in, and give me an eighth of my income, right? Even, leaving me with the same education and all this stuff, and we know that the people who are poor don't have the same education and all that stuff, my choice set changes dramatically. And so maybe I'm down from that 20, 25 choices or whatever I said to 5 choices. And maybe 4 of those 5 are not very good. And maybe I'm more worried, about getting some income or getting some food or whatever, and then thinking about which babysitter am I going to use, or which childcare center, or am I going to try to move to get into this school? So I don't necessarily think if we say that there's real reason to believe that there are underlying differences in parenting, that we're necessarily blaming people. But I think that we have to be realistic that there may well be a causal relationship where lack of access to resources affects the way you parent, right? So the second implication, I think, is, so CPS practice dictates not for reasons of poverty alone. But when we think about things like child neglect, how do we really sort that out? Like, how do you really separate, is this kid not getting enough food because they can't afford enough food, or because the parent is, for whatever reason, not allocating the resources, efficiently for food? And if you look at families, poor families with the same income, some of them will be food insecure and some of them won't, right? And so these are really difficult answers, and I don't have a good answer for how to sort that out. What I'm going to argue a little bit later is maybe we should be intervening for reasons of poverty alone. I don't think necessarily we should be substantiating or removing kids, but I would argue that maybe we should be intervening more. And I think, theoretically we should be, if a kid becomes involved with CPS, right, you should be connecting them to economic resources and things too, but I would argue that's not the main mandate of the system, nor is it the main focus of the system. And then I'm going to argue that, that these things point out to a need for explicit attention to the economic needs of maltreatment-related families. So if you look at most of the kids in the child welfare system are low income, most of the interventions we end up giving are parenting-related, right? And I'm not saying we don't need parenting-related. I'm not saying to get rid of parenting-related. I'm not saying to get rid of, alcohol treatment. I'm not saying to get rid of home visiting, mental health symptoms. But I think that we really need to think a lot more about this economic piece. And I think we need to think about, all these families that are reported and not substantiated, the majority of which don't go on to get a lot of services unless they come back. And what are we going to do about these families who largely have economic struggles? Okay, so I want to remind you, most kids in the child welfare system, but not all, are from low-income families. Most low-income families do not end up involved in the child welfare system, right? So I think it's important to keep in mind that we're not saying that most or all low-income families are maltreating. Okay. So what don't we know, right? So the first thing I think we don't know, I showed you a lot of associations that I say, they're starting to point toward a causal story, but I think we don't know whether there's actually a causal relationship between child maltreatment and income, or income and child maltreatment. So I think it makes sense to stop for a minute and talk about, what do I mean by causal or causality? So what does it mean to say poverty causes child maltreatment or low income causes child maltreatment? Anybody want to be brave? Yeah.
Is it that because they're poor? I mean, this is the main contributing factor.
So it doesn't have to be the main, but it's a causally contributing factor, right? Which means that the influence of that factor can't be explained by anything else, right? Does anybody want to add?
As opposed to like a random correlation, where they may not actually be related.
Yeah.
One, it's hard to explain it without saying cause to
Yeah.
the other.
Right, so it could be like there could be some sort of third factors that are contributing to both. You're both poor and you're maltreating or in the child welfare system because you have mental health problem or you whatever, right? So there's, was there somebody else? Yep.
And then to add on to that, so you've controlled for other factors and you have a statistically significant piece that indicates that indeed this can be expanded to the larger population.
Yep, so we want to, essentially we want to be able to say that it's, both represents some group or some population, and we want to say that it's, I would argue both significant, but in a statistical sense, but also a real substantive sense, right? If it's so small, then it may not matter. Yep. Was there other? So what? Yeah.
Poverty had to occur before,
maltreatment.
Right, so you'd want to see some, in terms of the timing, that it comes earlier. So the other thing that I just want to be really clear on, it's also probabilistic. It doesn't mean it's a one-to-one. It doesn't mean if you fall below a certain income threshold, you're always going to be there. That doesn't have to, it's not a condition of being caused. And so one good way to think about this is think about what does it mean that smoking causes cancer. I don't think anyone on earth who's in the right mind disagrees that smoking causes cancer, right? But not every smoker gets cancer. The majority of smokers aren't going to get cancer, right? It's just that if you can control for every other difference, if you can account for every other difference between smokers and non-smokers, you're still going to find a meaningful relationship between smoking and cancer, right? And that's what we're talking about when we're talking about causality here. We're not talking about an absolute at any level of income, right? We're talking about an increased probability that can't be explained by anything else. And the really hard part about sorting this out is that you can never get a causal estimate, a causal story for an individual. So you can never observe me as a smoker and a non-smoker at the exact same time in the exact same conditions, right? And so that's why people like randomization, right? Because what they say is, okay, I can never observe the same person in both conditions with everything else equal, but if I can get enough people, right, who are completely randomized, right, then on average, those people are going to be the same, and I can compare the group difference. So you can't randomize people into maltreatment or income, right? Although I'll argue in a minute that we sometimes randomize people into income. But we generally can't do that. So what we want to do is try a bunch of different statistical things. I won't go into technical details, but in the studies I'm going to talk about, we do a bunch of statistical things to try to isolate that effect and try to get at, okay, what is the average effect of a decrease of X amount or X percent in income on your probability of falling below some maltreatment threshold? Okay, so I argue that, so we have all these correlational studies. We don't have much causal evidence linking economic resources to outcomes. One place we do, so I just said I was going to say that we randomize income. So historically, we did negative income tax experiments in the 1970s. We've done lots of welfare experiments. And what they essentially do is either we have a randomized experiment where we say we're going to assign people to two different benefit regimes. So we did that in the years leading up to welfare reform and the passage of TANF. We said we'll randomly assign you to either get the old welfare system, so aid to families with dependent children, which had no work requirement, no family cap, I'm blanking on things, but basically you just got to check, and a more generous benefit than under TANF, or we'll randomize you to a TANF regime that has work requirements and family caps and things like that, right? Time limits, those kinds of things. And so that affects your income, right? And that affects work and it affects lots of things. Interestingly, like in all these, in all of these income tax experiments and welfare experiments, none of them linked to Child Protective Services except Delaware. Delaware was the only one. And so, so there's been all these studies. Look at New Hope in Milwaukee, which was a big experiment of a community-wide intervention to improve income and work. All kinds of outcomes they looked at: child achievement, behavior, but not Child Protective Services involvement. So Delaware did link to Child Protective Services administrative data, and what they essentially found was families that were randomly assigned to a less generous welfare regime were more likely to get reported to CPS and investigated, particularly for neglect. And so I would argue that that's a relatively strong causal story about the welfare generosity in general, not necessarily just income, because it wasn't just a difference in benefits. It was also you had to work, and you had the time limit, and you had all these other things. So you don't know what the mechanism is, what's actually driving it. So it may just be going to work more, and they have, still limited income, less time with my kids, less stable childcare, whatever. but it gives us a sense of that these things may matter in a causal way. Okay. So let's think about what are the mechanisms that may connect poverty and child maltreatment. And so I think this is another area where we don't have a really clear understanding yet. So I think there may be direct effects of resources. So literally, so despite policy that says not for reasons of poverty alone, right? If you fall below a certain income level, it's going to be very hard to provide the goods and services your kids need. And I think that could have a very mechanical effect of putting you at risk of neglect, right? So in terms of housing, clothing, hygiene, medical care, food, et cetera. So I think there may well be a direct effect of resources. A second piece, coming back to the point earlier, is this sort of stress and coping, right? So we know that being low income is associated with increased not only economic stress, but parenting stress, depression, et cetera. Lots of measures of psychological functioning, right, that are influenced by income or associated with income. And we also know there's a large literature, linking drops in income or low income status to harsher parenting and less warm parenting and things like that, right? And that may well reflect increased stress and high levels of stress and depression, things like that. We also want to worry or think about, well, maybe a lot of this is about surveillance bias or class bias. So lower income people are simply more likely to be reported or identified. And there is some evidence of that, right? So there's some evidence in the medical literature that you look at the exact same in the hospitals, the exact same break of a bone that could or could not be child abuse, and who's going to get reported, right? And it's more likely to be lower income people and people of color that are more likely to get reported, right? So we may worry about that. And then the last thing we really want to worry about is this idea of social selection, right? That the people who are both low income and at risk of maltreatment for a variety of other reasons, so that one's not causing the other. Why does this matter for policy? So why does it matter if it's correlational or causal? Yeah, so we can think about it as making the wrong laws, and we can think about it as expending resources, right? So if we think it's causal, right, and we can say, okay, so we can reduce child maltreatment by X% by transferring income, right, by having more generous income policies. And so if we're right and it's causal, right, that may be a really good use of resources, and that may reduce child maltreatment, that may be money well spent. If it's not, right, if it's just correlational, we could transfer a whole bunch of money and do nothing. So we might have other positives, but we could do nothing about child maltreatment. And that's why it's really important to try to understand if this is causal. Because if it's causal, honestly, so think about all the problems that families involved in child welfare system or at risk of maltreatment may be facing. So, whether they're mental health problems, whether they're substance abuse problems, whether they're histories of trauma, lots of things, right? I would argue that if there's really a causal story of income, it's a lot easier to fix income than all this other stuff. It takes a long time to deal with mental health problems, substance abuse. These are pretty intractable problems. If there actually is a causal role of income and we could estimate the size, it's not that hard. There's got to be political will, but it's not that hard to transfer income. You can do it through the tax system. You can do it through checks. You can do it in lots of ways. You could, right? Okay. Okay, so how might poverty matter for CPS involvement? And I want to get my whole thing here. So this is sort of thinking about a theoretical picture, right? And I think, I've said a lot of this to begin with. So there's a bunch of factors going on. So like your characteristics of the persons, of caregivers, how they grew up, their education, their mental health, et cetera, et cetera. And then there's a bunch of contextual variables. And so this would include the economy. This would include your access, the availability of public benefits, et cetera. And we can think of all of these things affecting your income, right? We can think of all of these things, actually this could have a line there potentially too, affecting your functioning, your parenting quality, the quality of your home environment. And so one way to think about, this poverty and economic hardship, there may be this direct effect of potential risk or harm to a child. There may be these indirect effects through functioning, through stress, through the quality of the home, et cetera. I think it's really important to remember if we're thinking about CPS involvement, right? Part of that process, there has to be some kind of because most kids, there are some older kids who self-report, things like that, but most of the time, somebody besides the parent or kid is doing the reporting. And to some extent, it's both interfacing with reporters and whether those people make a decision about reporting or not. And then all of these things can play out into what happens with CPS, right? Into whether you get a report and how CPS responds. Okay, so this is sort of this big kind of model we're thinking about as we go through this. And so part of what I want you to take away is there's a couple of different causal pathways, and there is, these two things are separate, actual risk or harm behavior and CPS involvement. Okay. So now I want to think a little bit about the broader US context around policy and the economy. And I'll move us a little bit into the Great Recession. So first, we've had clear economic insecurity. So, in the early 2000s and late 90s, we had a strong economy. There were still poor people. There will always be poor people. As we moved into the recession, right, we saw huge job loss. We saw huge problems with home foreclosure and things like that. So there's clearly, economic problems. We know that, that wages, particularly at the bottom, have been flat or declining for decades. I would argue that earned income tax credit, which is, and I'm going to show you a paper that focuses on that in a minute, which is a work condition tax transfer to low-income working people, makes a big difference, but we still have low wages. We have relatively high unemployment even now, though it's decreased quite a bit in the last 2 years or so. I would argue we have a somewhat limited safety net or system of access to public resources. So we don't have institutionalized options for emergency assistance. And I'll come back to that in just a second. So we do relatively little around affordable housing in the US, right? So we do huge housing subsidies, but largely around the mortgage interest deduction, right? Largely for owners. We spend a lot of money on low-income housing, but your probability of getting it is very low, right? So only about a quarter of those who are eligible are going to get it. So we have lots of housing instability. We have crowding and doubling up, those kinds of things. If we think about low-wage jobs, right, they're much less likely to be family-friendly, to offer paid leave, to offer adequate benefits, and those kinds of things. And I would argue, we've been getting better about making linkages across systems, child welfare and income support systems, but I would argue that we're still, the practice links are relatively weak. My overall point. So I think largely in the U.S. we operate in a context of fragmented and categorical social service systems. And this isn't necessarily true in the rest of the world. So in other words, you go one place to get your child care benefit. You go another place for your child welfare. You go another place for your food support, right? So we don't really think about what's the whole package of goods and services and resources that families need, and how can we kind of deliver that in a coordinated way, right? So I would argue that we have this sort of very fragmented system that deals with different categories of people differently, and is somewhat, you have to move around a lot and go to different places to get different needs met. So just going to show you sort of some things about what happened in the Great Recession, and then we'll move back to more of the story about child welfare. Okay, so 2005, so this is our child poverty rate, was about a little over 17, about 17.5%. By 2010, we go up to 22%, right? So that may seem like it's not that big an increase. So it's almost 4 percentage points, a little over 4 percentage points. So that's like a 20% increase, right? Almost a 20% increase, right? So the percentage points isn't that big, but if you do 18 divided by 4, right? So big increase in poverty. You know, as of 2010, it flattens out and comes down a little bit in the next couple of years. So let's see if we look at unemployment and employment. So part of the reason I want to show you both. So hopefully you've learned this in your social policy classes. So unemployment doesn't count people who have dropped out of the labor force. So in bad economic times, people stop looking for jobs, and they're not counted in the unemployment rate. So I would argue that often the employment rate is more important. So if we look at what happens with the employment rate, right, and that's on this scale, right? So what we see in 2005, you know, roughly over 60% of the, almost 63% of working age people are employed, drops way down in 2009, starts to come back up a little bit, but we're still well below the employment rate. If we look at, so this is the unemployment rate, right? So we see the unemployment rate increases, you know, dramatically right after the Great Recession, stays pretty high, and is now, you know, starting to come down, and it's, you know, down around here now. And then if we see the mass layoffs rate, we see the same kind of thing, like some really a high period of mass layoffs that starts to flatten out. Okay. So I made a point a minute ago about quality of jobs. So here's, you know, if we think about what jobs were lost and gained. So if we look at the jobs lost during the peak of the Great Recession from January 2009 to February 10, so it's actually after the technical end of the recession. So what we see is that, you know, low-wage jobs were hit the least hard, right? So these are jobs with a median wage of $9 to $13. So, but this includes the lower ones too. This is the average wage. Mid-wage and high-wage jobs were hit much harder. Okay. So part of what people, you know, you might think is, well, maybe Child Protective Services rates didn't go up as much because these, you know, these weren't the people that were hit as hard, right? If we look post-recession, right, what we see is most of the jobs gained were in the low-wage sector. So we're shifting in many ways from higher-wage jobs to low-wage jobs, and that's very true in Wisconsin. I gave a talk on Wisconsin poverty recently and showed some reports on that. If we look at foreclosure rates, so we saw, you know, in the housing boom, we saw many more lower-income families moving into and families of color moving into housing for homeownership for the first time. Two different measures, the bank foreclosures and the filed foreclosures. But essentially, you see the same thing, right? You see this huge increase of foreclosures kind of flattens out and starts to come down. So lots of housing instability, which really hit the lowest income homeowners the hardest. And if we look at the policy environment, so if we again looking from 2005 to 2012, so what we first see is, so this blue line is SNAP, food stamps, right? So we see this explosion in food stamps, right? That has barely come down even with the economy improving. And I think part of that reflects that a lot of the jobs being gained are low-wage jobs. So people are patching together both a job and food stamps. The second thing we see is unemployment. And unemployment, as you expect, would go way up and then starts to come down as people start to get jobs. And then the third thing is TANF, right? So this is our traditional cash welfare, which historically, when it was just a cash benefit, was very responsive to the economy. And so a lot has been made about the fact that that stays relatively flat. So very few people were going back on TANF or on welfare. There's a little bit of an uptick, but very few. And so there's a lot been written about, is it, you know, there's a work requirement anyway. If you can't get work, are you going to bother? There's a lot of hoops and hurdles to jump through to get on. But I think it's worth noting that this is not such a income insecurity, poverty responsive program at this point. So child maltreatment victimization rates. I showed you this in the big picture before, but essentially what we see is, we see a pretty substantial drop, leading up to the Great Recession, and then it basically flattens out. It actually comes down still a little bit more, right? And so one of the questions when we think about counterfactuals, if there wasn't a recession, would we have kept going down or not? And maybe that's the right comparison, and not did it go up? I don't have a good answer for that. But that's the sort of pattern we see. If we look at reports, screen-ins, and victimization, and so reports across this whole time period are pretty much exactly flat. So we don't see an increase in reports for at all over the time period. If we look at the second piece, so the screen-ins. What we do see, so we see a little bit of an increase in screen-ins. It kind of fades back down, not a whole bunch of movement. This, I'll argue, is relatively substantial. So in victimization, in substantiations actually drop pretty considerably, right? So on 3%, it drops almost a point, right? So it's dropping by roughly 25%. It doesn't look that big because it's only dropping from 3 to 2. But so essentially part of what's happening is we're getting the same number of reports, the same number roughly of screen-ins, and less substantiation, right? And so I'm not arguing whether that's right or wrong, but that's part of the story. Okay. So what do we know about research on the Great Recession? So the first thing is, I didn't show you a foster care rate, but foster care rates have been declining throughout the Great Recession and before. So we get relatively flat CPS involvement rates. We get declining foster care rates at the national level. But I'm going to argue again, there's non-trivial variation across states. So that's not true of all states. That's true on average. So there have been a few studies to try to look at state differences. So as states get hit harder with unemployment, with foreclosures, et cetera. So the first one was done pretty early in 2010 through 2011, focused only on 7 states and found basically nothing. So across those 7 states, unemployment rates, none of it was correlated with CPS. So Christy and I recently did a larger evaluation or a larger study where we looked from 2005 to 2012 at all 50 states. And what we essentially find is no associations between foreclosure rates, unemployment rates, benefit generosity, all of that stuff with victimization rates, but we do find associations with reports, screen-ins, and foster care rates, right? And I'll come back to that. There's also, so what may essentially be happening is there may be some differences in screen-ins, which could potentially reflect differences in the resourcing, right, in the capacity of the child welfare system. Sorry, not screen-ins, of substantiations, right? So then there's been a bunch of other work that's looked at over the course of the Great Recession, not CPS involvement. And that what they've essentially found is there's these measures of consumer confidence. They do these surveys every couple of months on how confident consumers are in the economy. And so what they say as people's confidence drops, they spank more when they feel bad about the economy. So that's trying to get out of what's actually happening to you in a general sense. Then there were a bunch of papers, or not a bunch, 2 papers, 3 papers, looking at unemployment and foreclosure rates, either at the hospital or county, or at the county or state level, and things like abusive head trauma and people showing up in emergency rooms for maltreatment-related injuries. And essentially those find that when both unemployment and foreclosure go up, you get more of these injuries showing up at hospitals. Okay. So I'm going to argue that so these suggest 2 things. So one is, despite these relatively flat, reports and victimization, right, there may be some underlying changes in behavior, and I think that these associations of the economic and policy factors seem to matter differently at different levels. So we did see, for instance, poor economic things were associated with more reports and more screen-ins, but not with substantiation, and things like that. And so I think that there's probably a much more nuanced story that we're getting just at the national level. Okay, so now I am going to highlight a couple of papers that we've done that really try to get at this idea of whether income and Child Protective Services involvement or child maltreatment are causally related. And the way we're going to try to do this is to try to identify a random aspect of people's income. Okay? So the first paper is not my paper. It's Maria Kanchan, one of our grad students, Myun Yang, and Christy Slack's paper. And it's the effect of additional child support on risk of child maltreatment. And so the basic question is, what are the effects of an exogenous increase? So exogenous means random. It means outside of your control, outside of the system. It's a shock. In household income on the probability of being investigated by CPS. So this is based on a study in Wisconsin. So at the beginning of the talk, I said that Wisconsin does lots of great policy experiments. So one of the ones they did was called the Child Support Demonstration Evaluation. And it kicked off in 1997. And so in AFDC and TANF policy, if you have a child support order and someone's paying child support on your behalf, that money goes to the state to pay back your TANF grant or your AFDC grant, and you get $50 maximum. So what this study did was say, let's look at if we give the recipient, generally mom, but it could be any any resident parent, all of their child support money, and the state doesn't keep any to pay back their grant. So let's see how that's going to affect their work effort, their family formation and fertility going forward, lots of different things. And so this was a big, it was 14,000 moms that were randomly assigned, right? And they were, followed for over 2 years. One thing I should point out, so they decided, in consultation with the state, they decided it wasn't fair to give some moms all of their child support and the rest only the $50. So they actually increased child support for the control group too. So the control group got the greater of either $50 or 41% of what was paid, whichever was bigger. Yeah?
I'm just confused by this slide. You have an experimental and control group.
Yep.
Is your T group the same?
Treatment.
T group?
Treatment, yeah. Sorry, so that's treatment. The experimental group gets the whole pass through the control group, right? So we've randomly assigned people into these two child support regimes, follow them for 2 years, and we're going to see if they had a screened in or investigative report over the next 2 years, right? Or they were, not my study. Okay, so first of all, so these are all moms who are applying for TANF. So these are low-income moms. So over a 2-year period, 20% of the control group, so pretty high, but it's something that it's not unexpected among a TANF population, have a screened-in CPS report, and about 18, 19% of the experimental group. If we do some regression estimates to control for any remaining differences, what we essentially find is a 10 to 11% difference. So essentially transferring all of that child support versus $50 or 41%, reduce child maltreatment among this group by about 10%. So remember, 2 points on 20 is 10%, right? 2 20s, 2 20ths. Yeah.
Was the experimental group made aware of the extra income that was?
So they knew they were getting it, right? So they knew they were getting the pass-through. Yes.
I just didn't know if it was something that was.
Yeah, no, so they knew they were getting the full pass-through. Yep. So why might this, have worked, right? Why might the pass-through have reduced CPS involvement, right? So one argument would be that it's a causal relationship, right? That this additional income, either had direct effects, decreased stress, supported good parenting, let moms be independent from relying on other people for income, which could potentially be a risk factor. What we do know is the moms were randomly assigned, and we know we've tested they're not systematically different, right? So we do know that it's not the spurious situation, and it's not based solely on just a correlation due to other factors. So I think that this is, again, more suggestive evidence toward this causal effect of income. But so one question I have is, is child support income unique? So is there a reason to believe that because it's child support income, instead of just totally random income, that it may not be causal? And the reason I think it may not be is, so when moms get more of the dad's child support, they get along better. The dads, are more likely to be involved with their kids. So what we may be picking up is these changes in relationship partly, and these changes in functioning and not just income, because it's income that's connected to the dad or the non-resident parent. Okay, so a second paper that I want to talk about is looking again at trying to identify families that have a random variation in their income due to something that has nothing to do with the family. And so we're going to look at the earned income tax credit, and we're going to look at changes in the earned income tax credit and how it affects families' income and how that affects CPS involvement. So again, what are the effects of an exogenous increase in income on the probability of being involved by CPS? So here I'm going to take a sample. This is a national sample of about 5,000 kids who were born all in big cities in 20 cities across the U.S. between 1998 and 2000. And then they've been followed, so we have data on them now until age 9, and we're in the field now, they're 15 and 16, collecting more data. So this is representative of births in big cities, but not all births, right? And then, they've been followed at 1, 3, 5, and 9. Okay, so one thing that I want to point out here, so this is not based on official CPS records. So this is actually asking the parent, have you been contacted by CPS and when? So what you would expect is that parents underreport, right? So that the rate would be higher than they actually tell you. So if that's true, that's going to bias my results towards 0. That means I'm going to be less likely to find a relationship, right? So it's actually a conservative estimate. And then I just want to point out that this probably means it's an investigation because parents generally don't know if they weren't investigated, right? Okay. So I'm going to look at income in a couple of different ways. Partly because, we do this funky kind of thing with our tax system that if you're married, both of your income counts. If you're living together, only one person's count, right? So you're getting this benefit based on the income that's counted for taxes, but I think that that's not the greatest measure of total family income, right? So what essentially I'm going to do is 2 different types of income. Going to calculate the taxes the same, the taxes you would get paid or pay or get refunded. And then in one of them, I'm just going to add on this extra income that your cohabiting partner, whoever may have contributed. And so what I'm trying to get at is this idea of post-tax and transfer income. Okay. So what's the earned income tax credit? So the earned income tax credit, it was started in 1975 under Richard Nixon. So this is now our biggest cash transfer program in the U.S. I forget exactly how much we're spending on it, but between that and the child tax credit, $60 or $70 billion a year. So it's a refundable tax credit, and that's really key. So tax credits that aren't refundable, if you don't make enough to pay that amount in taxes, it's of no use to you. So in other words, if I have a tax credit of $3,000, but I don't owe $3,000 in taxes, and it's not refundable, I don't get that $3,000. The earned income tax credit, even if you don't owe anything in taxes, it's refundable, so you get that money, you get a check. Okay. It only goes to working families or to working people. It starts at your first dollar of income. It goes, it increases, for a while into probably the $20,000 a year. depending on your family size and things, that flattens out. You keep getting the same benefit for a while, it slowly decreases. It's a really successful tax credit as far as decreasing poverty, as far as supplementing income. It has been expanded under every single president since Richard Nixon. And so I don't have the exact quote, but Ronald Reagan called this the greatest pro-work, pro-family, anti-poverty program or something like that the U.S. has ever had. So a relatively popular transfer, and partly because it's completely work conditioned, right? So any adults who are low income enough essentially are eligible for it. It phases out at higher incomes. There is a transfer for childless adults, but the vast majority of it goes to people with transfers. Over time, states have adopted additional earned income tax credits. So there's a federal one that's been expanded under every president since Nixon, and then states have at different times kicked in one. So Wisconsin has one that actually differs by 1, 2, or 3 children, right? And so they usually work, all of these work as a percentage of the federal tax credit. So in 1998, if I was a family with 2 children, I could get a maximum of $3,800 in that tax credit. In 2009, I could get a maximum of $5,028. If I live in these states, the state will give me an additional tax credit that's this percent of those numbers. And so what we're going to do is say, okay, this is the period that I'm observing these kids in this sample. They live in different states. So we also have, a bunch of states that have no additional tax credit. The federal tax credit changes over time. The state tax credits differ across states and change over time. And so what I'm going to say is that randomly affects, unless you're moving based on the EITC, which there's not much evidence that people do, that's going to randomly affect your access to income. Okay. So there are a few assumptions that I'll skip, but essentially what we do is, so we take the people's earnings, their family size and things like that, we put them into a computer program that calculates what their taxes would have been, what they would get for the earned income tax credit in their state and year, et cetera. Okay. Control for a bunch of stuff, including like what state you live in, what year it is, if you use prenatal substances, family size, education, race, family structure, lots of other things that might matter. And then, so we followed this strategy of a pretty famous economics paper. And essentially, we're going to use 4 different models I'm not going to go into that make different assumptions but get at really rigorous tests of this proposition. And what we essentially find is a randomly generated 10% increase in income. So that difference by being in a state and year where all else equal, you get a 10% more income because you're of a more generous EITC, is associated with a 5 to 10% decrease in Child Protective Services involvement. So I would again, argue that this is because we're trying to isolate this random aspect of income, points toward a causal relationship with income. Okay. So this study I'm actually going to skip. I'll tell it to you in 2 sentences. So this is another study in Wisconsin. Turns out when a kid gets removed to foster care, so this is looking at kids coming back from foster care. When a kid gets removed to foster care, the county can go after the parents for child support. So if the non-resident parent's already paying child support, they can start collecting it. The parent who was the resident parent, they can put a child support order on and start collecting child support. Maria and some colleagues did a study looking at it. Turns out in Wisconsin, counties vary pretty dramatically in terms of whether they actually do this or not. And so if you believe that that's random, right, that then based on which county you live in, there's a difference in whether your child support gets collected or not. And what they essentially find is that that collecting child support, get to the results, is associated with longer periods of time in care. Sorry, I'm going to get to their final results. Okay, so $100 increase in child support orders is predicted to, so $100 a month increase in child support orders, they predict increases the months to reunification or permanency by almost 7 months, right? So by charging people, child support, their evidence suggests that kids are much less likely to come home in a longer period. So that's less about, that front end of child maltreatment, but it does have an effect for whether income may play a role in the back end of the system with parents getting their kids home. All right, so sum it up. Poverty and economic stress are repeatedly shown to be associated with child maltreatment, right? I think that we're starting to generate a body of evidence that there's a causal role, but I think we still need some more research. I think that parenting behaviors don't seem to fully explain this association, right? So it seems to be there's also a separate piece that's income related. I just told you charging child support is associated with longer times in placement. And again, I want to come back to that most of our interventions focus on parenting and parental well-being rather than economic stressors. And I think we need to merge them more. And so we also think that there's this hole in our safety net for families that are high risk for child maltreatment, right? And particularly those for reason of poverty, but haven't crossed that line yet, that there is a limited likelihood of getting important services. So a couple things we could change in practice, right? I would argue it's really hard to deal with your parenting intervention when your economic life's in chaos, right? So I would argue that one of the things that we need to think about if we want to strengthen parenting interventions is dealing with these material resource problems at the beginning. I think, so we did a bunch, I'm going to tell you in a minute quickly about this Milwaukee experiment, but we did a bunch of pilots around the state around providing economic resources to high-risk families through family resource centers and things like that. And these are workers who are great with kids or great with parenting, who ask parents about domestic violence, about abuse, about all this stuff, terrified to ask them about income. Well, that's way too intrusive. Like, people don't want to talk about their money, right? So I would argue that one of the things that we really need to start doing is asking about income, asking about economic stress, acknowledging that economic hardship and parenting are connected and that economic hardship is likely to affect parenting. I think, when they're identified, consider, how they're linked to risk for children. So are they about decisions around spending versus limited amounts? And we can work with families on both of those things. And I think, we want to work with how much control do you have over these different pieces of your economic life in order to make poverty or income informed decisions. So I will quickly tell you, so let me see, I do want to tell you about this. So we have 13 minutes. I'm going to spend 4 minutes telling you about this intervention, and then we'll have questions. So what we did after we did these pilots around counties around Wisconsin, we ended up doing 11 in all with the Children's Trust Fund and DCF. And one of the things we found, so that was all to serve families that were touched by CPS, but there was no maltreatment findings. So some places were doing screen outs and investigated no finding. Some were doing investigated no findings. And the idea was to prevent these kids from coming back into the system. And so we started out with a very broad set of interventions that included economic support, but was also largely around parenting. Interesting thing, so these were all referrals from CPS, for families that don't meet our standards but could use some help. Almost the vast majority of their referrals were around parenting related issues. When the workers sat down with the families, 75–80% of them would identify together, the worker, one, if not one of their two main problems as being economic, right? So first of all, so there's somewhat of a difference, between how workers and particularly CPS workers and families were seeing their problems. But it really became apparent that this economic issue was big. And so we designed an intervention that we're piloting in Milwaukee that does 3 things. So it takes families that are screened in, assessed, and there's no finding of maltreatment. It randomly assigns them to a treatment as usual group, so you get some referrals, whatever. You might get some services, but you're essentially free of CPS, or random referral to a non-CPS affiliated community economic support organization that does three things. Essentially what happens is a worker shows up at your house with a laptop and a scanner and lots of information, goes through, okay, what's your financial situation? What's coming in, what's going out? Let's figure out, are there programs, public programs or charity programs, et cetera, that can help you get resources? So whether that's cash, food stamps, GED training, job training, but it's all got to be economically oriented. And if so, let's help you get signed up. Some of them you can do on the spot, some of them you have to go. A second piece is we do basic financial decision making. So we're not budgeting. We're not saying this is, your long-term spending plan. We're not even encouraging you to save. What we're saying is you got 10 bills, you can't pay them all. Turns out it's important which ones you pay and which ones you don't. Or pay part of these and not part of others. You get your check cashed. If you get it cashed at Walmart, it's $3. If you get it cashed at a check cashing place, depending on the size of the check, could be $40, right? Are there ways to avoid payday loans? Those kinds of things. And then the last thing is we do one-time emergency assistance with economic needs. So if you have, often it's a non-working refrigerator, non-working car, rent arrears, or need for a security deposit that families can get one time. About a third of the families get it. So lots of different types of services. And so we've randomized about 4,200 families so far. One of the biggest difficulties is about 40% of the families we can't find. So they've seen CPS within the last 90 days, so they won't answer the door, they won't answer their phone, or we just can't locate them. So about a good proportion of the treatment group, we can't even ask if they want treatment. So far, the preliminary results are less promising than I'd hoped. So the intent to treat, so the treatment control group difference, so granted 40% of the treatment is not even found, so they're not getting anything, and then not everybody takes up. We really found no differences so far, just in terms of CPS involvement. We do find a large subgroup differences for families that have had prior CPS involvement. So for families that have had prior CPS involvement, so the treatment group, about 15% have a second report in about a year, versus 25% in the control group. So for this subgroup of families, if we look at a substantiation, it's about 2% to 4%. A foster care placement, it's about 2 to 2.5 to 3 or something like that. So it seems like there may be a subgroup of families that this may work for, but so far the treatment control difference there really has not been as promising as I'd hoped. So I'll say two things about what that might be about. So we will be able to look at what resources they got connected to. And so one possibility is we've tried all these things and they actually haven't really increased their economic situation very much, or it's been short term. And we'll be able to find that out later. The other thing that I actually think hurt us is, and I hate to say it hurt us, but with the bad economy, the food stamps rolls went through the roof anyway. So many of these families that if we would have done this 5 years ago or 7 years ago wouldn't have been getting food stamps that were eligible are actually now getting them, right? And I think so that potentially we didn't increase their resources as much as we may have in an earlier time because so many people already took up food stamps. So that's all I got. I hope this was helpful, and I'm ready to take questions. So in Milwaukee, it's the Social Development Commission, which they go to houses, yeah. So they're not necessarily MSWs, they're economic support workers. Some of them came from different backgrounds, from supportive housing, I think one of them came from. They've been in community economic support agencies and things like that. So they know about, we did 3 months of training. So we did 3 months.
Worker, and the workers I would use were not, and you wouldn't mark it down with child welfare. It's so different line, because I was in this
So, but remember, this intervention, essentially, they don't get any information about their CPS report. They just get so they know how they're being randomized out of CPS. But the worker just shows up, and we have all this stuff like you've been selected randomly by lottery to have the ability to participate in this economic support program, and we might be able to offer you some services and those kinds of things. So they're not doing any. So so they don't ask about parenting, they don't ask about domestic violence, substance abuse, mental health, nothing. If the family brings it up, essentially we say, call 211 and they'll give you a referral. So yeah, so the idea was, and I'm not arguing that this is a panacea, but if we want to know if this income piece matters, we can't offer the whole package of services. You won't know what's driving what. And so the idea is that if this does make a difference, then you can think about putting these modules into home visiting, putting modules around this stuff into other CPS interventions, other parenting interventions.
What about the effect of policies that are time limited? Is there anything in this where you're actually giving families cash assistance that, like, if they've already hit the time limit for TAMP and they're no longer eligible, is there anything else, or is it just using services that everyone perceivably could be?
So besides this one-time emergency supplement, Flex Fund, we are only using things that families are already eligible for but not receiving. And so that was a conscious decision, because I would love to do an experiment where we just randomly gave families $5,000 or $10,000 and looked at what happened. It's not realistic in the policy world right now that we're going to do unconditional cash transfers. I just can't imagine it. And so what we argued was, look, this is things that we have designed and set, the regs and the policies around, that we have already decided these people are eligible for this. And it's either, a knowledge issue or a motivation issue or a too many hurdles issue or whatever. But these are things society at the current time has said that you're entitled to if you can qualify. And so we really wanted to base it on just connecting people to things they were already eligible for. And so, are some of those things too limited? Maybe, and maybe we'll find out. I mean, first I'll be interested to see, how well we did at increasing incomes to begin with. I mean, the main thing that at this point in time is time limited is TANF, W-2. So this is my opinion. I think that's such a small part of the policy landscape now that it's just not the major relative program for most low-income families anymore. Yeah. So, yeah.
How many people said no thank you?
So I think of the people we reached, like roughly 60%, or maybe a little more, 65% said yes. So now, not all of them keep following through. So it's only a few appointments for most families. So there was some group of those who said yes and then never did anything else, or we never got back in touch with them. We can still follow them because we can follow all their administrative records. But, actually I was pretty pleased with a 60-65% acceptance rate is, quite good, but then there's this other 40% we're not even finding, right? And that, we've been really working on, and it's just, it's been, difficult, yeah.
Are the families told that there's this option for emergency assistance money when they're introduced to?
For the Flex Fund? So the Flex Fund's got to be a last resort. The worker has to show there's no other available fund for it. So, yeah. So we do sometimes get, like, neighbors call, oh, yeah, my buddy told me that you can get some money. And we have to say, like, we're sorry, it was only, selected by lottery. Yeah.
I work at Dane County Parent Council, a family outreach worker with Head Start kids, 3 to 5-year-olds and the families, and the job that I do in actually is we essentially try to connect families with resources.
Mm-hmm.
So we do family visits and we do a questionnaire, and a lot of those questions are actually about income and being able to pay their rent and parenting. And then from that, we go on to making goals, like family goals or a family plan, what
Yeah.
they need resources for, or what is something that they're trying to work for.
Yeah.
And I find it that if they don't trust me, I can be there a whole day and we're not gonna get anywhere.
Yeah.
But if I've had like a relationship with them, then it's so much easier to get somewhere and actually develop a plan. Even though if I know that they have a lot of needs and they have a lot of issues and there's not a lot going on, it's really hard for them to even be straight up about any of the answers, especially when it comes to income, when it comes to work or employment or paying for certain bills.
Yeah.
And then from there actually doing, if I provide them with resources, actually going to appointments or not changing their phones or having a vehicle.
Yeah.
And even with us providing transportation, it's still tough.
Yeah. So it's very, so then that's part of the reason why we always go to them, which I know that Early Head Start home visiting does too. And I think like the Early Head Start folks have been at the forefront of a lot of this kind of stuff in trying to connect families to resources too. So I think the relationship thing is you're right, it's really important. I think it becomes somewhat more important when you're doing multiple things with the parenting and a lot of the other functioning too. But largely you also just have to be able to show people you can deliver, right? You gotta have some customer satisfaction. And I think we actually did, interestingly, so for some of our training, we moved away from doing like the home visiting trainings and things like that, and we used the UW Survey Center. So the folks who go out and interview low-income families for surveys and for research. And the reason we did that is because they're really good at like talking their way in the door. And like they're really good at kind of not taking no for an answer and selling, right? Because they got to say, will you spend an hour with me and complete this survey? And we actually, and we used a lot of so when people aren't home, we leave this little bag, Project Gain and blah, 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 and, like these sort of enticing things. We learned that the Survey Center rarely makes appointments. They just show up, right? So they just, they feel like it doesn't make a lot of sense. People tend not to keep appointments. So once you're in the door and once you know the family can make appointments. But so we do call and send a letter first, but we don't necessarily set appointments. We just show up. And some of it is like, I get that we want to respect self-determination and empowerment and those kinds of things. But I also think that we should do a little more marketing and a little more selling of things. Because look, people should be skeptical, and I think people are going to be skeptical. So if I first got this Project Gain stuff, so it turns out the Social Development Commission is relatively well known in Milwaukee as a nonprofit, et cetera. But like you'd worry that it's some scam that wants me to give them money to they're going to tell me they're going to get me out of debt if I pay them, those kinds of things. So you expect people to be skeptical, but I think we do want to do a little bit of selling. Yeah. But I think, there are great points about about both the relationship building and the problems that families are having. So one thing, do you guys have a really systematic, like you go through every eligibility program and you type in their income, or is it more, so we literally go through like figuring out, like spreadsheets to figure out what you're eligible for? Or is it more with these families around connecting them to,
Be under a certain income level. I think they could be over.
No. Sorry, not to get into the Early Head Start. No. When you're thinking about connecting them to other programs, do you sit and literally figure out, oh, you're eligible for MA, you're eligible based on your family size, your work, your blah, 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 you're eligible for each program?
What resources do you have right now?
Yeah.
And
So-
if you already have those, which other resources
So-
can you do?
Okay, great. Yeah. Other stuff? Yeah.
Can you talk more about the capacity of the CPS systems? I've been thinking about how you were saying that lower income, the amount of jobs have increased while middle and higher income jobs have decreased. And I know CPS workers make not the lowest income.
Yeah.
They don't make as much as they should, but and just the capacity in relation to I've just been trying to wrap my
So I think
head around it.
so capacity issue is hard. So part of the capacity issue is hard. So part of the thing I bring up about the job separately is, so I think that, that overlaps in the capacity. So one thing that might be happening is that there's a difference in screening, in substantiations, right? So, and that may be, so we're having more screen-ins, but not more substantiations, right? So it means that people aren't being substantiated at a higher rate. And that may have to do with capacity, right? I don't know that. So one of the things that there's been a lot written about and that I worry about a lot about with the CPS system is, so while we know we miss a lot of kids, so I would argue that the biggest problem is way too many kids get reported to CPS, right? And I would argue that we spend all this time doing investigations and assessments that are largely not going to go anywhere, right? So the problem is we don't really have another system. Right, so if we had more of a child well-being system, so that you could just refer people to that, or some kind of holistic income support system that would connect you to a variety of things, including mental health, and then you could report them. But we just don't really have another system, which is problematic. But so I think what ends up happening, and this isn't my original thought. So there's a really great book called The Future of Child Protection by Jane Waldfogel in 1998, and part of what she argues is that we've gotten into this situation where we're so overwhelmed with these investigations that it ends up hurting everybody. So those folks get an investigation and almost nothing else. That takes resources away from the highest end kids, who are the only ones that are really going to get served anyway, right? But they're going to get less resources than would be devoted to them if we weren't spending all this on investigation. So my biggest worry is, are there ways of trying to, and I think some of the front-end differential response, alternative response, is made to address that, but it's still within the system, right? And so what I would like to see is much more, so maybe the Project Gain's not going to work, but alternative systems that aren't a part of CPS, right, that are going to address a lot of these other issues and that let CPS really be about, more intensive abuse and neglect, right? And less so about all these poverty and other issues. Move it to another system. Somebody's got to pay for that system, right?
We're out of time, but I know Michael had one question, so we'll do one more question and then we'll just finish, and I think Lonnie can stay for the
Yeah, I'm happy to stay.
Okay.
If we can go back to Project Gain, so you didn't keep track of how much more funding or resources they were able to get for these families?
Well, we do know that. We haven't done it yet. So here's the way. So we can do it in terms. So we have part of this IRP state relationship university. We have an agreement with the state where we essentially harmonize and warehouse all their administrative data. So we will look at, almost every system you can think about. Earnings, because we have UI data, UI benefits, SNAP benefits, child care, child support, child welfare, other systems, Badger care. So we will do that. We just haven't done it yet because it's expensive to do.
Well, I ask because hasn't there been research where there has been like a one-time payment to families that have shown, like if you just give a family like a one-time sum, then it has led to all these decreases in CPS?
Not that I know of. So the EITC is essentially a once a year. You can get it monthly, but nobody does. Very few people do. And so, you could argue that the EITC is a benefit with that. So I don't know of any experiments where they've randomly given people a sum of money and seen if it affects CPS. I would love to see something like that. But not that I know of. If you know of them, please let me know. So, yeah. Great, thank you.